afternoon. Am I audible to all?
Yes, audible.
Yes.
Yes.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon,
Yeah,
ma'am. Audible.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Yes.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon to all of you.
On behalf of the management, staff, and students, it's my prodigious delight to greet you all. Let's all encounter the existence of the Almighty in this heaven-sent time. It's my pleasure, elegance, to build the honorary, the superlative soul of the day, Ms. Gaana Jayagopalan, Assistant Professor, Christ University, Bangalore. Historiography of mobility in India and its associated pedagogy is her focal research area. Her current research interests include colonial discourses located within Neo-Victorian Studies. Other areas of interest include minority discourses, especially Dalit Studies, apart from an engagement with contemporary Indian English fiction. My esteemed greetings and gratitude to our principal, Reverend Sister Dr. Colonial Discourses, for her magnificent guidance. Her reinforce for her today's instance is fathomless. I enlarge my salutation to the galaxy of masterminds who are eagerly awaiting for this session. Today's webinar will point at the directions that we as academics must take into our newly fashioned classrooms and into the lives of the community at large. Afresh, I greet you all to this serene prominence. It's over to Gaana ma'am. Gaana ma'am, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, let's start the session.
Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible. Let's
Yes,
start
great.
the session.
Yes, we are good to start.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, first of all, at the outset, let me thank Raji and her team at St. Joseph's for having me here and persisting to come and interact with the academic community. This was something that should have happened maybe a couple of years ago, but I'm glad that it is finally happening. Although, of course, it's happening in this virtual context. And when she asked me if I could speak on literary theory, I said perhaps not literary theory per se, but try and contextualize it in the present time. So this particular talk will be very, very rudimentary. It could perhaps be things that a lot of people already are aware of. They're all things that we already know, but it will definitely help all of us to talk about these things as a community in the kind of context that we are currently living in. So I have a quick presentation to make, especially because the technological sessions may hinder us and it may cut us down. Even if there are other technical glitches in terms of connections going off, etc. Let me apologize at the outset for any delay that can be caused from my side. Let us also see how we can organically try and evolve a way of making sense of this entire system itself. Is the presentation screen visible to everybody? If just
Yes,
one
ma'am,
of
it
you
is
can
visible.
tell.
Visible.
Okay,
I think you
great.
should
So
start it.
I will quickly start. So
Okay.
I will give sort of an overview in terms of what we're actually doing and what we are intending to work with in that larger sense of the term. So I've called it literary theory in our present times, and I have also placed literary within quotation marks. And the reason why I've done this is because we just need to be a little more critical maybe, and also a little more conscious of the fact that literary is only an inflection to theory. It's one of the ways in which we can think about theory itself, and theory has many manifestations which we should probably also consider as academics who might be practicing in departments of English or philosophy, wherever the case may be. So that's why I have used that within quotation marks. We'll come back to that part a little bit into the presentation itself, but just a bit of caveats to go into before we begin. If anybody here is hoping that at the end of this session you will have a clear idea of what literary theory is, then I'm afraid I would be disappointing you, because this is not going to be telling you what theory is, or you will not have a nuanced understanding of post-structuralism or Marxism or feminism at the end of this session. This is also not going to tell you how you can apply theory. All right. So the webinar itself is not centered around getting to know theoretical frames better, but I'm trying to at least get all of us to converse and have a dialogue on a different sort of a realm. If that is not what this webinar is about, then what is it? It is definitely going to be a reflection on the human question in our present times. And this is something that we should all become very conscious of, considering the times that we have come to inhabit today. And it is becoming more and more pronounced in terms of recognizing the significance of the human question today. And that's exactly what I will hope to explore with everybody here, by way of contextualizing theory itself and trying to get a grander sense of how we can think about theory in our present times. The second thing that we will also do is to think of what we can do with these skills that we have. So assuming that we are training ourselves in theory, or assuming that we are already trained in the theory, as the case may be, what can we do with these set of skills? So that's another thing that I wish to explore. But at the same time, I think we should all, perhaps we will all leave with more questions that we can all think about at our own levels, rather than answers that will help us maintain certainty. And the times that we are in now, certainty is definitely something that is highly, highly debatable in various ways, in various walks of life. And therefore, I believe that at the end of this discussion, perhaps we will have, each one of us will have a lot more questions to think about as academics, as teachers, as people in the higher education spaces, rather than having certain kinds of answers that will establish some sort of certainty. So with those caveats in mind, let me maybe quickly get about 3 or 4 responses from some of y'all, either by way of chats, or if you want to say something, maybe you can take a couple of minutes to do that. But one of the things that I want to ask ahead is, what is it that we do with theory in our classrooms? We study that as a subject, we write examinations, we teach students how to engage with theory, but what is it that we are essentially doing with theory? If we can get some quick responses on the chats, perhaps, just as a way of...
Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
I think by knowing the theories, we are trying to contextualize the writings, and we understand how to criticize, the way in which we can interpret.
Okay.
I think we are doing that by doing the theory. But listening to your introduction about what you're going to do today, I wish to know that, are you bringing in maybe a slight irrelevance of the theories?
Okay, may not be irrelevance, maybe a certain irreverence, if I may say. But definitely, yes, that's exactly something that I would be hinting at. But yes, one of the things that we do with our theory is definitely provide analytical frames to think about things that will also help us to work with certain context of reading, literature, etc., whatever the case may be. Okay.
I think some audio disturbance is there.
Okay. All right. Does anybody else want to quickly come in before I could probably move on, especially with want of time? Right. Okay, so let's move from this point that was made by one of our peers here about thinking of, interpretation, about thinking of critiquing text, about thinking of developing certain analytical frames to think about text. And that's pat on. That's exactly what we do with theory as well. So when we think about theory at the very fundamental, rudimentary level, we are interpreting. What are we trained to interpret, or what are we training our students also to interpret? We are training them to interpret text. And when we say text, of course, post-structuralism will tell us that text is not necessarily just the printed text that we are all familiar with, but it also broadens our understanding of the world of text itself to mean various kinds of things, including human experiences. So not necessarily just literature alone, but in terms of what post-structuralist thought will tell us, with regard to discourses. So we try to understand discourses, we try to provide a critical framework to make sense of discourses, and that's what we are engaging with. So if we are interpreting texts in the post-structuralist sense, what are these texts essentially about? And we know that these texts are about human lives. And again, let me reiterate here, I don't necessarily mean literature alone, but it could mean absolutely anything that the post-structuralist thought brings within itself when it says text. And of course, to say that it brings everything under the sun as text is a very reductive way of saying what post-structuralism does, because although Derrida says there is nothing outside the text, he means there is nothing outside textuality, which is nothing outside language. So that is a far-reaching sort of conclusion that I'm drawing when I say that, you know, texts are about the kind of discourses that we are working with, and there is nothing outside the text, borrowing from the post-structuralist thought. Essentially, these are about human lives. And we as people who are practicing theory, about thinking of theory within our own curricular context, must believe that there is a certain meaning in the kind of exercise that we involve in when we think about doing theory itself. And this is exactly what all humanities disciplines will also tell us, and that's what they're training us to do as well, that they're teaching us that even in our interpretation, like I've mentioned here, we are surrounded by other lives and we are surrounded by other stories. Now, this recognition of the fact that we are surrounded by narratives, or we are surrounded by stories or narratives are the only way in which we make sense of the world, is one of the first important lessons that we gain from theory, which is what we try and impart in some ways with our students by getting them to train themselves in interpreting text, to understand other people's lives, to understand other human stories. So in some ways, it is trying to reassure all of us that perhaps in our sorrows and joys, we are not alone. We are always surrounded by other human texts, other human stories, who are also living a life that is very, very centrally governed by this kind of fundamental human experience. So in that sense, where does something like this take us to? I would like to very quickly go into broadening the idea of theory and bringing it within the larger scope of philosophy and, of course, humanities, where philosophy, theory, etc. is practiced, which is why I placed literary in quotation marks at the outset. So literary is just one other inflection of theory, and we should know that theory is essentially informed in a big way by philosophy, specific kind of philosophy that emerged in Europe at a certain point in time. It has its own tradition, it has its own linearity that it follows, and then we have the 1970s when a spurt of new theoretical ways or approaches of thinking about the world itself begins to emerge. And given this exercise of philosophy being rooted within the humanities as a discipline, there is always this cultural imaginary that is built into doing philosophy as a useless exercise, that somebody who studies to become a doctor might be more useful to the society than somebody who might be studying philosophy, because there is no immediate utilitarian value that is brought by the philosopher. That's the larger conception that is associated with most disciplines within the humanities, philosophy being a forerunner, in fact, in that sort of an understanding. So that is a stereotype that tends to be associated with philosophy, which is a wrongly constructed and a misconceived notion. The fact that philosophers don't really do anything and that they are useless is largely a construction of how we think about knowledge itself as being utilitarian. The fact that I can do something in my lab and therefore that becomes useful to society, as opposed to I sit at my desk and I think and I write and I publish, that does not become so useful to the society. So that misconception is always built within the larger context of how you think about philosophy itself. But if you think of philosophy ever since its inception in terms of how we study it, although inception would be a wrong way to think about philosophy itself, it is something that is largely associated with what Michael Burrows calls public practice, meaning to say that philosophy has always emerged from social, political, and cultural context. It has never really emerged in a certain vacuum. It is always informed by a certain understanding of this public practice, which becomes very, very fundamental in terms of how we think about philosophy per se. Just thought about how Socrates or Plato or Aristotle came up with their philosophies. They came up with their philosophies within the context of the republic, and that became one of the fundamental, rudimentary sort of foundations for them to build their knowledge about what it means to think, what it means to act, what it means to write, what it means to serve. All of these concepts came up within that public sort of a context. Of course, it has its own politics about who was allowed to practice this, who was not allowed to practice this. That's for another day, for another debate altogether. But the point that I'm trying to reiterate here, made by Michael Burrows as well, is the fact that this notion of associating philosophy as being a useless exercise is a misconstrued notion, and that philosophy has always been in the forefront when we think about how it has been come to be practiced today, and therefore that's a public practice in that sense. The other examples that I have also mentioned here will make this clearer, I hope. For example, Hannah Arendt, who has written extensively about totalitarianism in her work Origins of Totalitarianism, was able to do that in the face of an emerging fascist Holocaust sort of an environment. The other person I have made a mention of is Angela Davis, who is an African-American philosopher thinker who brings her Marxist training and her Marxist leaning in terms of trying to think about the prison itself as an industry complex. And there are very interesting, fascinating documentaries on how Angela Davis is able to do some of these things. Michel Foucault, responding to the larger kind of European constructions of knowledge, etc. So the point that I'm trying to bring about here is the fact that you can't possibly think of philosophy as being devoid of a public responsibility. It is something that is coming up in the context of a public responsibility, just as much as a doctor might be working with his or her profession, or a teacher might be doing this, as the case may be. So today, increasingly across the world, you will see that humanities, which was not really being given that kind of importance, is beginning to gain a lot of significance and importance in higher education. A very important work by the philosopher Martha Nussbaum is Not for Profit, where she's talking about the role of humanities in building future democracies. And if you do not have humanities and instead you only have STEM education, then that's not really going to serve the purpose of the world that we are going to get into. And I think the contemporary condition will make it all the more evident, which is a point that I will come to in just a bit. But the idea is that today, the call for humanities to do philosophy, to think about some of these very important philosophical concepts, is more pronounced and more significant perhaps than any other time in the last few years. I'm not really dismissing the importance of humanities and philosophy in the last few years, but I'm trying to contextualize it within the kind of context that you and I are also in today. And in this sort of a situation, how exactly do we see the humanities itself then playing a certain kind of a role? Which takes me into the heart of what I want to talk about today, which is to think of what does our training in things like theory and philosophy do when we are contextualizing it in the COVID-19 sort of a condition. How do we use this training for a better effect of making sense of the world? How do we then also get our students to make better sense of their world through this kind of a literary theory training? And it is here that I want to introduce, this is just one aspect of the importance of humanities and philosophy in the contemporary context that I'm talking about. And this is only indicative. This is absolutely not exhaustive. But for our short discussion purposes, I've tried to make an inventory of sorts, not so much an inventory, but at least a list of things that we can possibly think of in this particular context, to look at the understanding of disease as we understand it today in the COVID-19 condition. You can't possibly think about it merely as a pandemic, merely as a reflection of the physiological conditions of a human body, but this as having very significant, important intersections with social, political, and cultural questions. Within medicine, for example, there has been a burgeoning of a new field of inquiry called medical humanities and narrative medicine, where the entire onus of medical practitioners is to develop medical practitioners who are more sensitive to the human question. This is something that began in the early 2000s in the United States. It was started by this doctor who was practicing called Rita Charan, where she decided that she will train an entire cohort of medical healthcare professionals, nurses, doctors, and other people who interact with patients as people who will not look at the patient as just another number, who will provide them with a set of signs and symptoms that they are trained to read, but as humans who are telling stories. So the moment you recognize the fact that the human is telling a story, you're also establishing that sort of a human connection. So this, they believed, would be possible by training medical professionals, very interestingly, by getting them to read literature. So what Rita Charan did was to devise a course called narrative medicine, in which she is trying to train many of these medical practitioners to read literary works about disease, about health, about caring, about all of these kinds of things, to help the professionals gain a more systematic or a more concerned, you could probably think about it as a very sensitive way of responding to the human question. And it is here that questions of bioethics become very, very significant. Ethics itself rooted in the field of philosophy and its engagement with the question of the larger biological sciences. Think about the debates that are surrounding around vaccines today, and you will see that you will be able to locate it in a far sharper way if you have a humanities training, rather than merely as someone who's been trained in a lab to create a vaccine, right? Who has access to this vaccine? Who are the people who are producing these vaccines? What kind of profits are going to be made from these vaccines? Why is there a race for vaccines across the world? It is only because of the kind of global geopolitics that is inherent in creating a cure for this particular disease, right? Now, things like this will become far sharper for us when we think about it, not merely as a mechanical exercise that is being done by pharmaceutical industries, but these pharmaceutical industries also as responding in very specific neoliberal contexts that are gathering their own strength through, making certain inroads into their capitalistic structures. So that's one way in which our training in theory will also help us think about the disease question currently. Think about the other mention that I've made here, reading numbers. For example, we are saying that there are 1,000 odd people who have died because of the COVID disease. But are we also willing to consider the number of migrants who have also died in this entire mobility that ensuing in our country because of the coronavirus and the lockdown? You don't consider those numbers as a result of the COVID infection. Where does this necessity to look at death in the context of COVID-19 become far more important only in the context of the human body having a set of physiological symptoms, because of which some people unfortunately end up losing their lives. But there are also many, many people who have lost their lives without really having had any of these symptoms, but are directly related to the effect that this virus has had on us as a community. How do we then begin to read numbers in terms of death in such a context? And this is something that you can extend to various other kinds of contexts as well, wherever you encounter this question of death. The third important point that does definitely come up is the question of biopower, a very fundamental post-structuralist concept that was theorized extensively by Foucault, by Agamben, where they're trying to tell us how there is going to be a certain kind of power that the state will now rest with us in terms of recognizing us as citizens, in terms of recognizing us as people who are eligible for certain kinds of things, right? So when it comes to treatment, for example, who are the ones who are now eligible for treatment? What are the ways in which this treatment can be made available to them? That's exactly how it actually started. As of today, you will see how the politics around the Arogya Setu app is far more significant within questions of privacy rather than merely trying to mitigate the effects of a disease. And this, a lot of people have cautioned us about how this can come into a way of functioning as a very regulatory sort of a mode. And the writer Yuval Noah Harari has also made a mention of how this is not something that is true only in the context of our country, but it is true in the context of various countries across the world, especially places like China, which has seen extensive surveillance as a way of justifying to know what citizens are actually doing. So that's the direction that we are also taking. In that context, how does our training about Foucault's methods of thinking about the biopower come into picture? The next important point, which is directly, I think, relevant with all our exercises, is what is the nature of language that is used when you talk about the disease itself, right? So you had an entire sort of controversy breakout because the President of the United States mentioned that this is a Chinese virus. Also coming with it, a lot of stereotypes and a lot of prejudices associated with having to now discriminate against people. And a similar sort of a strain was also seen in our country when they began to describe a certain community as being responsible for the spread of the virus, which is telling you that you are not sensitive to the way in which you're also using language to talk about a very precarious human condition. As Judith Butler would talk about precariousness and precarity in her work, we are all extremely vulnerable, which is why we are all sitting in the confines of our homes and then having this sort of an interaction. If it makes all of us equally vulnerable, how is it that certain communities become far more vulnerable to other kinds of attacks that are a result of this sort of a construction? That is possible for us only when we begin to think about how we can look at language that is used to talk about this disease. At this point, I just want to flag off a very fascinating research that has been carried out just as recently as the end of last month in April by a group of researchers who work at Microsoft Research Bangalore. They are working for a group called Technology for Emerging Markets. They've tried to analyze the different kinds of information that has been circulating in social media in the months of March and April. And they've been able to see how the kind of language that people have used has completely changed over a period of time. For example, in the beginning, when people began to talk about this virus in early March, some of the most important forwards that were extremely viral were how, within the Indian context, you have very evidently cures that can be made for this virus. For example, going out into the hot sun will ensure that you will be safe from the virus, or having honey and lemon and all of those kinds of home remedies will also make sure that you will be cured of this virus. But by the end of April, they are able to see how this sort of an information became very, very less, where people began to circulate this kind of information as a cure for the disease. Why is that so? Because by then it was fairly well established that the cure is not going to be here anytime soon. The world over, people are trying to figure out a way of combating this disease by way of providing a certain kind of a cure. And the only way in which you can think about mitigating the effects of this disease is by distancing yourself. And therefore, initially, when the World Health Organization came up with the idea, social distancing was the term that was used. And increasingly, people began to realize that that term also has a lot of other kinds of semantics, right? Social distancing as a way of legitimizing social discrimination, which is exactly what happened in our context last month when we saw how the number of cases rose and we began to realize that this is a dangerous situation. And it was so easy for many of us to simply point our fingers at a particular community. And therefore, WHO also recommended that we should now be not using social distancing, but physical distancing, where you may be distanced from each other physically, but you continue to maintain those social ties and you continue to maintain the human question that will help us care for the other, right? We have seen instances after instances where doctors are not allowed to come into their apartments because they've been treating corona patients. We've also seen one instance in Chennai where a doctor was refused to be given a decent burial even after his death, especially because people feared that they are now going to catch the disease. I mean, this sort of a community that we have come to be is also because of the kind of fear that has come to inhabit our work. So in this sort of a context, what sort of social contracts are actually upheld? What kind of people are helped? What kind of discriminations are enabled? What kind of discriminations are disabled? And that's why I think we should be using our training in theory to deeply inform us about the critical value that we can bring to our interpretation, rather than simply talk about using Marxism as a way of analyzing, a novel in the classroom and leave it just at that. We must recognize that the novel is a novel about human lives. That precarity that we are talking about in the novel is something that we can also at some point in time go through, in which case, how are we as people who are practicing in the humanities, how do we respond to this kind of a situation, right? So going to a little more specific sort of a context, higher education has also been highly affected by this particular instance that we are in right now. We are all taking online classes from our homes, finding it extremely difficult because we are so used to the physical spaces of a classroom now. Students are also finding it so difficult because they have to now adapt themselves to newer modes of learning as well. But in a more anthropological sense, if I have to draw again from theory, structural cultural anthropology that will inform us about certain kinds of structures and parallels that always provide a sense of meaning to communities, right? So anthropologists make sense of it by studying rites, rituals, passages, etc. And think about how world over higher education has completely changed now, meaning to say that March, April, May might have been the time when people finish their examinations. People in their final years of their undergraduation or post-graduation will finish their exams and then get their degrees. This getting the degree itself is called convocation, which is a ritual, which is a performance, right? So you take that physical act of going on stage, getting your degree, and then moving. From that point onwards, you are a different person altogether. So educational anthropology looks at this as liminal sort of positions that we hold. I was not a postgraduate until then. The moment I am declared one, I become a postgraduate. And similarly, again, think about PhD vivas that are now being held online, and you have those declarations also being made in the virtual world. So that entire notion of a campus narrative of people saying goodbye, saying their last goodbyes to their friends on these, send-off days or convocation days. These are all very important moments in higher education for students as well. And for us as academics, when we see students move from one year into the next, these are all very important moments as well, which we have all missed. And therefore, there has been a huge beating in terms of understanding how higher education also has been affected by this kind of a space. So this training in our theory in structuralism perhaps will tell us that similar kinds of epidemics have always taken place previously. History will tell us that communities of human populations have done certain things, have not done certain things. But increasingly now we are coming to inhabit a different kind of a world. So how do we come together to make sense of this in terms of our interpretation would be something that a cultural anthropologist interested in education would also be willing to think about. So all of this draws us to trying to go back to this question of what we do when we do theory itself, right? What is it that we are then training ourselves to do or training ourselves to be? From beginning with the idea of interpreting texts in the literary sense of having a literary text and then saying this is exactly what the interpretation means, etc., to arriving at a point where we are thinking about lives, your life and my life, as being in some ways informed by this theory, is the large jump that I'm trying to get everybody to make a sense of as well. How have we been coping with this period of lockdown, as it were, which seems to continue into many more weeks to come, at least definitely for higher education? We are not allowed to go into our workspaces and have students come into our classrooms and study. Many of us are taking the online route in that sense. So how exactly then do we make sense of something like this? The word theory itself, interestingly, comes from the word theoria, which means to have an inaction, meaning to say that you don't do anything but contemplate. And that's exactly how theory itself comes into being. And this is Aristotle's contribution, where he says you can think about inaction in two ways. You can think about it as leisure, where you do something and you stop and then you go back to it. And this kind of an inaction where you don't do anything but you think. And that thinking itself is a very important utilitarian sort of an act. Perhaps utilitarian is a wrong choice of word, but a very purposeful act. And this is exactly what we should do in academia. And that's why the Academy of Plato and Aristotle was also training students to think in philosophy, the faculty of reason. That's exactly what they were all involved in. So if humanities is telling us so much about human conditions, we must all remember that this is also increasingly a time where we are told that we should become more productive, right? You're all at home. You all have a lot of time on your hands. Why don't you conduct a webinar, right? These are compulsions that seem to emerge within higher education context. And you will see how each day there are at least hundreds of such webinars that are being conducted, which are now available to a large number of people at the same time. But where is this impulse also coming from? This impulse is also coming from the need to remain relevant in higher education during such a time. Is it possible perhaps for somebody to say, no, I do not want to be so productive at all? Maybe I cannot be as productive as I am when I'm in the physical spaces of the classroom, because when I'm back home, there seems to be more demands that are placed on me by my family members, because of which I'm not able to contribute very productively. Perhaps going to my workplace for 8 hours a day was a better way of me being productive. Or very simply, I just don't want to do this. I just want to think and reflect and understand what I want to be, or what I am actually doing right now. We are all involving in a lot of distractions, I'm sure, catching up perhaps on our lost readings, or watching all of those films that we did not get to watch all along on these streaming platforms. These may be looked at as very, very trivial, but they're also telling us about how we are working with making meaning about the time that we have right now, right? So who could probably say that me watching a film that I would like to watch on the streaming platform is not really useful work at all? Perhaps there is something that I'm gathering from that story, because isn't theory after all about human lives and human stories? Then am I not involving myself in a productive work? There is a lot of work that is emerging right now in terms of understanding anxiety and higher education, where teachers are extremely anxious, students are extremely anxious. For instance, I just finished my first online class today when we formally started, and I don't think I really did a good job at all, because I'm so used to the physical spaces of a classroom where I need my board, I need my students, and that is a far more interactive mode. But I cannot probably say, look, this doesn't seem to work for me, and I cannot just close my mind to the entire thing. I must now begin to develop capacities to consider myself as being relevant here, because maybe this lockdown is lifted in 6 or 7 months. There could possibly be another lockdown where my students again would be distanced, and what am I going to do then, right? So this becomes a far more significant question for us to ask. What does it mean to remain productive? How do we understand this question of productivity within this kind of a context, and how do we probably make better sense of this productivity in that larger scheme of things, would be the larger point that I want to raise here. And I've said two things here: to see things differently. Will this pandemic and the time that we have right now provide us with an opportunity to see things differently, to see things that are not there, and also to see things in places that are actually heard? And I want to bring in here Wallace Stevens, a very significant American poet, into question, and not so much into question, but maybe to familiarize all of us with what he was trying to say, in a very, very fascinating poem called 13 Ways of Looking at the Blackbird. And it's an inventory of what the speaker believes are 13 different ways of looking at the blackbird. A very interesting poem, especially for people who would want to teach phenomenology to their students, but not going into those details. In that poem, one of the ways in which you can possibly look at the blackbird is by looking at the non-existent blackbird. That's one of the ways that Wallace Stevens actually brings in, and like to quote the lines here. He says, or the speaker rather says, when the black bird flew out of sight, it marked the edge of one of many circles. So in these lines, what the speaker is trying to say is not so much the black bird itself, but the kind of lines that the blackbird left behind when it went out of sight. So what you're seeing is not the blackbird, but the circles that have been left behind by the blackbird. Another very fascinating line or an image that he draws is, the river is moving, the blackbird must be flying. Look at how he's trying to parallelly give us a sense of movement of both the bird as well as the river at the same time. So he's telling us that we should probably look at the blackbird in a different way. And one of the things that somebody has also made a mention of is how the 13 ways of looking at the blackbird as a poem always tells you that there is a 14th way to look at the blackbird. And that's a very interesting comment. Yeah.
Excuse me, ma'am, sorry to interpret. Correct me if I'm wrong. Could we relate it with Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven?
Yes, but Raven, of course, goes into a more philosophical understanding of life and death. But here, in terms of what the poet is drawing our attention to, is very simply interpretation itself.
Different ways of interpretation, right?
So yeah, right. So where do we draw these?
In a different way.
Yeah, where do we draw these interpretations from? And more importantly, is the 13 ways of looking at the blackbird given by the speaker here the only 13 ways? Perhaps not. There are going to be several other permutations as well. So that's something that we should probably think about as a way of thinking about, things like inaction. Look for meaning in places where you would probably not look for meaning in, every single context. So then what do we do with theory? And I believe that this is what we must do at all times, not just now. We should not use it to mechanically interpret texts and generate papers or essays, which are all, of course, requirements of higher education in a big way. We are told that we should write, we are told that we should present papers, we are told that we should publish. But when we are doing that, we should make that interpretation count. And that can only happen when you do not see theory as a mechanical application of many of these processes, but we become a little more sharper and a little more aware, rather, of how we think about interpretation itself, how we think about lives of fellow human beings, how we think about narrating stories and making sense of those stories. So making this contemplation, making this interpretation a question of a higher calling for academics like you and I should be something that doesn't happen necessarily only in our classrooms, but a part of our everyday lives. And this will only happen when we begin to, like I said, see things in places where we don't generally see them. Maybe we should look for things in places where we hear them and not necessarily see them. And we should also probably begin to see things very, very differently. And that's exactly what theory and philosophy necessarily trains us to do. We must now encourage our students to become more conscious about the time that they are in, reflect about it, and think about it, and see if they can write, share these stories, make value, add value to the stories that they are trying to share, and in terms of adding to the larger notion of building a human community that is going to be able to work with this. In fact, very interestingly, there was a time when we all were told that you should get an education, go into colleges, go into universities, that's the way to survive. But now we are all told if you want to survive, you should not go to the college, but you should sit back in your own houses, right? So think about how the notion of survival itself has completely changed. And in this context, how can we make our classrooms count? How can we make our theoretical interventions count? How can we add value to many of these interventions? That should be the larger point. And I would like to end at this point. I think it will show up again that we do not really have much more time. So I've made it as short as possible. Dylan Thomas says, do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And I think this in some ways will speak to all of us and resonate with all of us in the times that we have come to inhabit now. And there could not be a more opportune moment for us to reflect and think what we should probably do with theory itself in our classrooms to our students, rather than using it as a mechanical way of reading text, generating interpretations, and merely adding it as quantifiable numbers. Instead, like I said, make our contemplations count. So I'll stop here, and I would like to invite questions if we have the time. I think the organizers can possibly tell us if there's time.
Gaana ma'am, can
yes.
I?
Sure.
The way you connected philosophy, humanities, and the contemporary situation and everything. So I infer actually, I actually want to question about the relevance of the existing philosophy and theory.
Go on.
And yes, so there is a need for questioning everything, whatever is already existing. So I think your view actually gearing up for new philosophies and new theories, right?
Not so much generation of new philosophies and new theories, but very simply reflect on our own practices as educators, as academics, as people in higher education, in terms of making these philosophies that we perhaps already know more relevant to our students, and not make it about just one of those courses that comes up on the student's transcript, where the student does not really know. I mean, you encounter students day in and day out where they say, I apply deconstruction, and you will have to correct them to say that, deconstruction is not a mechanical application tool. It is something that should emerge from the text, and that's what Derrida is showing us. So that sort of a move can only happen when you make that contextualization of theory far more relevant. That's the larger point that I was trying to make. It was not
so
to in any way dismantle. Yeah, it was not to dismantle existing philosophies. Absolutely not, because all of this, what I've said, is informed by all of these philosophies. What I'm trying to say is, let's make that philosophy count, which I think is a far more useful sort of an exercise rather than what would otherwise happen within our own classrooms. Yeah.
So avoiding mechanical applications, I think you are
yes.
You are guiding us into new way of contextualizing these theories, right?
Yeah, but that's how it should always be. And if it is new, it is good, but that should perhaps become the mode from there on, is the point that I'm trying to make as well. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. I understand that you are really guiding us.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions?
Anything else?
So any other queries? It was an excellent presentation, Gaana ma'am, really. So no queries? Shall we end the session?
You're free to ask whatever, I mean, that you probably would want to know.
So we'll go to the vote of thanks session, ma'am. I think no other questions. It's over to Lalita ma'am.
Good evening to all. First, I thank our principal for her everlasting guidance and support. And next, I thank Mrs. Gaana ma'am for her informative and inspirational speech. And also, I thank all our participants for their active participation throughout the session. And I am sure that all the participants of this webinar is benefited. Again, I thank you.
Thank you, Lalita ma'am. Thank you all for participating in our national webinar. Thank you all.